Hello and welcome back to the Bloodspiller channel. In this video we're going to be going over all of Hammer's vampire films, all 15 of them. Here we go. Hammer's first vampire film, Horror of Dracula from 1958. This is Hammer's second horror film, but a lot of people consider this to be an improvement over Curse of Frankenstein. This brings back the Dream Team from Curse of Frankenstein. If you ever hear about the Dream Team in Hammer, it's the team of Terence Fisher directing, Jimmy Sangster writing, and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in the lead roles. This happened 3 times for Hammer, including Horror of Dracula. Horror of Dracula, it's like the Lugosi version, except turned on its head a bit. We got Harker going to Castle Dracula, but he is already in the know. He is already working with Van Helsing. Both versions seem like they're trying to, use the source material, Bram Stoker's source material a bit. Jonathan Harker going to Castle Dracula, not as a realtor, but he's going to be Dracula's librarian. He is working with Van Helsing to dispatch Dracula. Dracula unfortunately finds this out pretty early on, and Van Helsing hasn't heard from Harker in some time. He goes to Castle Dracula to find him, but he finds Harker vampirized and Dracula missing. The 50s was a decade that was dominated by a lot of sci-fi and a lot of cheap sci-fi. So when Hammer came knocking on the proverbial gothic door, people started taking notice, and that included censors as well, which would be kind of a running joke for the company. But they pushed back as hard as they could against this, including in ways, if you read up about the missing reels, the missing footage of Christopher Lee's death scenes that are actually intact in a Japanese release. Hammer would push the envelope continuously with different films going forward. They absolutely would win some of those battles against the censors, but early on they were pretty strict, especially in the late 50s. There's so many great parts of this film. Dracula at the top of the staircase coming down is just incredible when he bursts through the library entrance. Mina's staking scene is very memorable as well. It seems like they really paid tribute to it in Dracula Dead and Loving It. That's like a direct homage, although it's done for comedic effect. And also, as I mentioned, Dracula's death scene. It's probably the best death scene in Hammer. So if you wanted to see Hammer's crown jewel, or if you and Hammer are virgins to one another, this is certainly a great place to start, especially if you haven't seen any of their vampire films. Up next, Brides of Dracula from 1960. Christopher Lee wouldn't return as Count Dracula in this. He would return as Count Dracula in Dracula Prince of Darkness 8 years later. We got Terence Fisher coming back as director and Jimmy Sangster writing the script, which gives Cushing the license to carry this role on his back. The story follows Yvonne Monlar, who plays Marianne Danielle, who on her way to a teaching position becomes stranded and is offered refuge at the castle of the Baroness Meinster. Here she discovers the Baroness's son, Baron Meinster, and he is a vampire. Once freed, the Baron begins to turn the local women into his undead followers. Dr. Van Helsing steps in to combat this new vampire threat, leading to a climactic showdown. Brides of Dracula stands out, obviously not for Dracula himself, but for expanding the lore of vampires and introducing Baron Meinster. The film cemented its position as telling compelling vampire tales either with or without the Count. I personally would have loved to see more films like this where Peter Cushing is playing Van Helsing and he goes on to combat different forces of evil, maybe even beyond vampires. Could have been an interesting series. Some of my favorite scenes in the film include Baron Meinster hypnotizing his mother on the staircase, which I still think is one of the scariest moments in Hammer.
Mother, come here.
No, my son.
Mother.
Baron Meinster not causing a reflection in the mirror is also pretty scary. The fight in the barn between Baron Meinster and Peter Cushing is very athletic. And these little skirmishes we have between Meinster and Van Helsing, they feel a bit more even-keeled than a dominant Dracula versus Van Helsing. It's no longer a super heavyweight versus the knowledge of Van Helsing. It seems like they can kind of go head-to-head. If you're invested in the Hammer universe, this film is a must-see. For me, it's a top 3 film in their vampire cycle. It provides a great side mission for Peter Cushing to go on, while Christopher Lee is being withholding, while still delivering that great Hammer horror atmosphere.
Only evil is good, and the only kiss, the kiss of the vampire.
Kiss of the Vampire, 1963. After Brides of Dracula, Christopher Lee still wasn't on board to play Dracula, so Hammer pivoted from a script known as Dracula 3, and they made Kiss of the Vampire, without him or Cushing. The result showcased a lot of unfamiliar but capable talent for creating richly atmospheric and visually compelling horror without having to rely on their established vampire lore. Directed by Don Sharp, an Australian director that had never made a horror film before, Tony Hines would pen the screenplay, while Clifford Evans, Edward D'Souza, Noel Willman, and Jennifer Daniels were in the leads. The story follows Gerald and Marianne Harcourt, a newlywed couple who finds themselves stranded at an airy and isolated inn after running out of petrol. They receive an invitation to dine with a mysterious family, the Ravnas, who turn out to be part of a vampiric cult. Just like a spider weaving his web for the unwary fly, the Harcourts are just dazzled by this charming and kind of hot family. But fellow inn-stayer Professor Zimmer delivers drunken, cryptic remarks, warning the Harcourts to stay away from the chateau. This was Hammer's 3rd vampire film and their first standalone one. Kiss of the Vampire was notable from its departure of its traditional Dracula-centric narratives. The film stands out for its unique take on the vampire mythos, gorgeous set design, and chilling atmosphere. It exemplifies Hammer's skill in crafting horror that is both engaging and eerie, while exploring new territory in their vampire lore. Some of my favorite scenes are the eerie deserted Grand Hotel, piano-induced wife hypnosis, the devilish masquerade, and death by hordes of bats. Most Hammer fans I come across have generally favorable things to say about Kiss of the Vampire. If there are criticisms, there seems to be some people who criticize the film because it lacks Cushing and Christopher Lee, but I hardly think that's the fault of the people that made the film. So if you can get past that, then it's one of Hammer's best. Dracula Prince of Darkness, 1966, finally brings back Christopher Lee as the Count in a see-sorry-type Dracula film from Hammer. Directed by Terence Fisher and written by Jimmy Sangster, Christopher Lee returns as Dracula, also starring Francis Matthews, Barbara Shelley, and Andrew Keir. The story begins with 4 English travelers stranded in the Carpathian Mountains who seek refuge at what they think is an abandoned castle. They soon discover the castle belongs to Dracula, who is resurrected by his faithful servant Clove by using the blood of one of their guests. Count Dracula resumes his reign of terror after about 45 minutes of waiting for it to kick off. Released 8 years after Horror of Dracula, Prince of Darkness marks the first time of Christopher Lee coming back, something that I think was basically a necessity for Hammer's new US distributor, Warner Brothers. They basically wouldn't distribute Dracula films unless Christopher Lee was in the role. Lee would return to the role under protest, but it wouldn't be the first time he'd return for the role, and it wouldn't be the first time he complained about it either. Notable scenes include Dracula's resurrection, Staircase Entrance Part 2, Dracula's First Snarl Part 2, and even stuff from Stoker himself. If you liked Horror of Dracula, Prince of Darkness has a similar feel, even having the same orchestral theme, and even though 8 years later, it still feels like a classic Hammer film. If you told me Prince of Darkness had come out just a few years after Horror of Dracula, it would certainly pass the eye test. Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, 1968. The 3rd true Dracula film for Hammer, and one Lee would return in, and in traditional Hammer style, they would continue their reimagining of Stoker's work. Lee always maintains that he was basically guilt-tripped into these films. Freddie Francis is now in the director's chair, along with Tony Hines writing the screenplay, starring Christopher Lee, Rupert Davis, and newcomers Veronica Carlson and Barry Andrews. The story takes place a year after the events of Dracula Prince of Darkness. A small European village lives in fear of Dracula's lingering presence. When a Monsignor returns to exorcise Count Dracula, he inadvertently facilitates Dracula's resurrection when a priest that was acting as his guide hits his head and the blood conveniently trickles down to Dracula's mouth. The Count, seeking revenge on the Monsignor for sealing the door of Castle Dracula with a cross, terrorizes him and his family, ultimately leading to a dramatic confrontation between Dracula and the protagonist/atheist Paul. This is Paul number 1, Paul the Baker. There's a lot of Pauls in these movies. Released in the late 60s, Dracula Has Risen from the Grave is notable for its rich cinematography and trippy color palette, which added a new depth to Hammer's gothic aesthetic, as well as show they were willing to adapt to the times. Freddie Francis, especially during the opening credits, seems to have elected for a more modern aesthetic, something I can't see original Hammer director Terence Fisher doing. This is a great movie if you like Dracula in action. You get Dracula tossing somebody out of a coffin, Dracula chilling and fighting on rooftops, Dracula evilly whipping, and of course the new lore that if you stake a vampire, it doesn't work unless you pray, kind of like birth control. The film marks a bit of a departure for the Hammer Dracula series, going for a more modern aesthetic and leaving some of the gothic behind, and thus highlighting the studio's ability to evolve and enhance their storytelling ability. The atmospheric visuals, very likable leads, and different kind of plot make it a standout in Hammer's vampire mythology. Taste the Blood of Dracula from 1970. Hammer continued their mandate to include young leading protagonists and blending horror and social commentary into a chilling tale that adds even more depth to their Dracula saga. Peter Sasty directs this one, with a screenplay by Tony Hines. We also have Christopher Lee returning, along with newcomers Anthony Higgins, Linda Hayden, and Ralph Bates. The story follows 3 wealthy and morally corrupt Victorian gentlemen who seek thrills by delving into the occult. They meet the debonair Lord Courtly, who helps them acquire Dracula's cape, ring, and dried blood. During a ritual to resurrect Dracula, Courtly is killed, but Dracula returns to exact his revenge. Dracula targets the gentlemen's families, leading to a confrontation between Dracula and young Paul. Paul Countdown number 2, Paul the boyfriend, who must protect his loved ones and defeat Dracula. Released in 1970 and actually being one of 3 vampire films released in that time for Hammer, Taste the Blood of Dracula marked the beginning of a different social commentary for Hammer. The bad guy in this film really isn't Dracula. It's a Victorian gentleman. While claiming they're doing charity work, they're really doing infidelity, gambling, whatever. They're bad guys. Released in 1970 and actually being one of 3 Hammer vampire films made in 1970, Taste the Blood of Dracula reflects the changing social attitudes of the 60s and 70s, incorporating themes of hypocrisy and moral decay. The adult film and the men are pretty bad, always operating under the guise of charity work or church stuff, but you can easily see how their actions affect the well-being of their kids, especially for Linda Hayden's character, whose dad is friggin' awful. To me, this was the first Dracula film where it felt like Dracula was a subplot, and that was a bit by design because the first draft of the script didn't even contain Dracula, or they had Dracula coming back in the end to punish Lord Courtly. Hammer really wanted to pass the baton onto somebody like a charismatic Ralph Bates, but Warner wasn't having it, so they were basically saying, get Lee or it's not happening. Some of my favorite parts of Taste the Blood of Dracula are charity work in the West End, the ceremony at the Sanctified Church, which includes some really great outside shots of Highgate Cemetery, and of course, the lovely, evil Linda Hayden. Taste the Blood of Dracula stands out because of the willingness of the studio to adapt to a younger audience. The atmospheric direction, strong performances, and engaging visuals makes this a Hammer film that I feel like gets better with repeat viewings. It's an intriguing blend of horror and drama that could have been a lot different than it actually was. The Vampire Lovers, 1970. Hammer once again dove into the Gothic, but this time brought a little more titillation to the formula, with The Vampire Lovers marking the beginning of the Karnstein trilogy. Directed by Roy Ward Baker and produced by Harry Fine and Michael Style, written by Fine and Style and Tudor Gates, The Vampire Lovers feature standout performances from Ingrid Pitt as the alluring vampire Carmilla alongside Peter Cushing, Kate O'Mara, and Madeline Smith. Set in the early 19th century, the story follows the beautiful and mysterious Carmilla Karnstein, who infiltrates the households of the aristocracy under various guises. Preying on young women, she leaves a trail of terror and bloodshed. The narrative centers on a relationship with Laura, a young woman who becomes her latest victim, and the subsequent efforts of Laura's family and friends, led by Peter Cushing, to uncover and stop Carmilla's reign of terror. Released in 1970, The Vampire Lovers stood out for its explicit exploration of sexuality and horror, pushing boundaries for the era. It was one of the first films to portray vampirism as both horrific and seductive, combining gothic aesthetics with provocative themes. Ingrid Pitt's performance as Carmilla is both captivating and a bit heartbreaking.
You're so sensitive.
Only about some things. And about you.
Silly. Why about me?
And even though she's known for her looks and being super naked in this, I think she's a tremendous actress, and I think this is her finest role. Some of my favorite scenes are Carmilla's ball entrance, touching moments with Carmilla,
Why, I do believe you're jealous.
Why should I not be?
and maybe some scenes I can't really show. I've talked to a ton of Hammer fans that love The Vampire Lovers, and it's not hard to see why. At the very least, it's a contender for the best in the Karnstein trilogy. And since the censors were becoming more relaxed around this time, that opened the door for Hammer to create not just more provocative movies, but ones that allowed for the melodrama to be swapped out for something more surreal and abstract. Scars of Dracula, 1970. Hammer's third vampire film from 1970, and a bit of a departure from what they're originally doing. The storyline of the last couple entries has basically abandoned, and it seems like this is sort of a reboot, with a heavier reliance on blood and violence. Directed by Roy Ward Baker, having just directed The Vampire Lovers for Hammer. Also has a screenplay by Tony Hines. Christopher Lee returns as the fearsome Count, accompanied by Dennis Waterman, Jenny Hanley, and Patrick Troughton. The story begins with Count Dracula being resurrected once again. He takes refuge in his castle, instilling fear in the nearby village. The film starts out with Paul number 3, aka Horny Paul. Horny Paul is a young man who finds himself a prisoner in Dracula's castle because he was trying to get laid twice in one evening, and his brother Simon and Simon's friend Sarah, who venture into danger to rescue him. Scars of Dracula marked a more brutal time for Hammer. This is around the time Hammer was losing some financial pull, and you could tell the budget aesthetics were showing that. I think Dracula's castle looks great in this. Absolutely looks cheap. You started getting to the point where you could see Hammer was cutting corners, and some of the sets looked a bit cheaper, and there weren't as many locations filmed at. To make up for that, Hammer introduced a lot of blood and violence into this, making it probably the most graphic Dracula that Hammer had done. Christopher Lee's character is more sadistic and ruthless, adding a new layer of menace to this character. And since there's nothing really to compare it to, storyline-wise, it's very possible that Scars of Dracula could be a prequel, making it the first time it's happened in the Hammer Dracula series. Some of my favorite scenes include the bat attack in the church, the guy that Christopher Lee said was personally one of the funniest people he's ever met, scaling the castle walls, and of course the final scene. If you liked Hammer's other vampire films, but wanted to trade in some of the atmosphere and storyline for something a bit more darker and gritty, Scars of Dracula will have you covered. It may be a bit of a black sheep in the Dracula series, but I've always found it easy to enjoy, even if half the film is people going places and telling people to stay put while they go other places. This also has a bit of a throwback gothic quality to it, like we're watching a medieval version of Dracula, almost like a Paul Naschy film. It always comes back to Paul. Lust for a Vampire, 1971. As the second entry in the Karnstein trilogy, Lust for a Vampire leans more into the seductive and sometimes silly, still manages to be a satisfying Hammer experience. Directed by Jimmy Sangster and written by Tudor Gates, the film stars Yeti Stensgaard along with Ralph Bates, Susan Lee, and Michael Johnson. Set in 1830, the story follows Richard Lestrange, a writer who was doing research for his horror novels. He arrives at an all-girls finishing school to bother the students until they give him a job as a teacher. Mircalla arrives and seduces pretty much everyone, including her instructors. Lestrange becomes infatuated with Mircalla while trying to court Mircalla. Lestrange can't ignore the mounting evidence that Mircalla could be the reincarnation of the vampire Carmilla. The movie is known for a strong sense of eroticism and gothic atmosphere, but I feel like it usually takes a backseat to the Vampire Lovers and Twins of Evil. You might not take it as serious as the other two entries in the series, but it's still great. Some of my favorite scenes include Strange Love. The mysterious deaths of the students.
A heart attack.
And the final and fiery confrontation. I'd recommend this film to Hammer fans and those interested in gothic tales with seductive twists. The combination of horror and eroticism, along with the atmospheric setting, make it a unique and memorable entry in Hammer's vampire repertoire. If you like the Vampire Lovers but wanted the camp fader pushed up a bit, Lust of the Vampire will have you covered.
The devil has sent me. Twins of Evil.
Twins of Evil, 1971. Twins of Evil is the third and final entry in the Karnstein trilogy. The Legend of Hell House director John Hugh is in the director's chair, while Tudor Gates again pens the screenplay, with Fine and Styles also producing. Peter Cushing returns to the series, but in a different role. Cushing was supposed to be in the previous entry, Lust for a Vampire, but I believe he was replaced with Ralph Bates after Cushing's wife had passed away. It is crazy to think, though, potentially Peter Cushing could have played 3 different roles in this trilogy. Twin Playboy models Madeline and Mary Collinson played the titular vampire characters. The film follows identical twins Maria and Frida, who move from Venice to Karnstein to live with their uncle Gustav Weil after becoming recently orphaned. Weil is a stern Puritan and leader of the fanatical witch-hunting group the Brotherhood. Both twins resent their uncle's sternness, but Frida becomes fascinated by the local Count Karnstein, who is involved in Satanism and black magic. Count Karnstein turns Frida into a vampire, leading to a cat-and-mouse game between Weil and Karnstein for the fate of his nieces. This may be more than any other vampire film for Hammer seems to explore themes beyond good and evil, and bring religious fanaticism to the forefront. It's notable for just how gothic it gets for such a fairly late entry for Hammer. This would be a time where Hammer's finances would start to take a nosedive, especially when their distributors in America were becoming less interested. Twins of Evil does a great job of mitigating the budget constraints with great characters and atmosphere. And while Mary and Madeline Collinson were dubbed for this release, something unfortunately Hammer did, and probably more than they needed to, I don't think it distracts or detracts from their performances. Some of my favorite scenes include Gustav meeting his twins.
What kind of plumage is this? For birds of paradise?
Count Karnstein meeting Frida. Count Karnstein turning Frida. And the secret exit at the end of the film that just looks beautiful to me. The film's themes of religious fanaticism and the duality of human nature adds depth to the narrative. Additionally, the film's historical setting and atmospheric visuals make it quite a captivating experience. The film feels weirdly medieval and provides good character arcs that weren't traditionally part of the studio's mission statement in the 50s and 60s, but began to reflect the times better in a social context in the studio's dying days. Vampire Circus, 1972. Directed by Robert Young and starring Adrian Corey, Thorelli Walters, Anthony Higgins, and John Mulder Brown. Set in the 19th century, the film follows the story of a small village called Statel, which is plagued by a mysterious illness. The villagers believe the plague is a curse from Count Mitterhaus, a vampire that was killed by the villagers years ago. A traveling circus arrives in the village, bringing with it a series of strange and deadly events. The circus performers, who may or may not be vampires, prey on the villagers' children in an attempt to resurrect Count Mitterhaus. The villagers must confront the circus and its dark secrets to save their children and lift the curse. Very much a Sins of the Fathers type of horror film, Vampire Circus stands out for its imaginative and eerie circus setting, which adds a unique twist to the traditional vampire narrative. The film also incorporates themes of revenge, fear, and hysteria. It's an interesting entry for Hammer as it doesn't follow the normal structures of the leading characters in their approach to the conflict, but rather elects for a stable of actors to take the brunt of the lead. Eventually, John Mulder Brown and Lynn Frederick emerge as our de facto leading couple, but it feels like a bit of a glorious mess. I did hear that Hammer kind of ran over budget with this, so they had to wrap it up fairly fast, but I don't really think that affects the quality of the film. Some of my favorite scenes include the opening scene when Count Mitterhaus is killed, the trapeze artist vampires, and Count Mitterhaus killing the Burgomeister in the mirror. To me, Vampire Circus is Hammer's most unique vampire film, and not unlike Twins of Evil, they were trying something different as opposed to the simplified and rather stale Christianity versus vampirism setup. It's nice to see a lot of new faces, just like in Kiss of the Vampire when Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing weren't involved, but it worked because of just how great the cast actually was. Hammer's most art housey film, hands down. Dracula AD 1972, from 1972. Directed by Alan Gibson, who would go on to do the follow-up Satanic Rites of Dracula. This is the 7th installment in the Dracula series for Hammer, and features a contemporary setting bringing the Count into modern day. This reunited Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee for the first time since Horror of Dracula, and introduced us to newcomers Stephanie Beacham, Christopher Neame, and Carolyn Monroe. The film begins in 1872 with a final battle between Count Dracula and Van Helsing, resulting in Dracula's death. A century later in 1972, a group of groovy young friends, including Jessica Van Helsing, played by Stephanie Beacham, are lured into a black mass ceremony by Johnny Alucard, a disciple of Dracula's. During the ceremony, Dracula is resurrected and begins to prey on the group, seeking revenge on the Van Helsing family. A descendant of Van Helsing, played by Cushing, must once again take up the family vampire hunting mantle and try to rescue his granddaughter. Dracula AD 1972 was the first time Hammer brought Dracula into the modern times, which was an attempt to update Dracula for a more modern audience. I think the selling point here, even though I don't think it did well theatrically, was having Cushing and Lee back in those roles, but since its release, it's garnered a bit of a cult following. Some of my favorite scenes include Van Helsing and Dracula fighting on top of a stagecoach in the opening moments of the film. Basically, anything Johnny Alucard says.
That's it. Now you've got it together, that's it.
Johnny Alucard.
Got you all going, didn't I?
Johnny Alucard.
Jessica, you'll never find her! You can rot in hell!
And the climactic showdown between Van Helsing and Dracula at the end.
Look on me. And remember.
If you thought this was gonna suck based off the backdrop, I was right there with you when I first saw it. But when I did first see it, I was overjoyed about how fun the film was, and how much I actually enjoyed the concept. They didn't abandon the gothic atmosphere, they brought it with them, so that really appeased the monster kid in my heart. Plus the characters, dialogue, and setup just makes this one of the most fun Hammer films.
Count Dracula.
The Satanic Rites of Dracula from 1974. Alan Gibson's follow-up to Dracula AD 1972 returns Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. Joanna Lumley is now playing the Stephanie Beacham role as Jessica Van Helsing. Christopher Lee does return, but there seems to be an unhealthy dose of spy thriller injected in lieu of traditional horror elements from Hammer. I guess Hammer was in panic mode and they were just trying different things to trying to freshen up the formula. Bringing Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee back were two big things, but they also brought back Michael Coles as the Inspector for Continuity. Set in 1974, the film follows Professor Van Helsing, who is investigating a satanic cult on behalf of Scotland Yard. The cult, led by Count Dracula but under the alias D.D. Denham, plans to unleash a deadly plague to commit global genocide. Van Helsing, along with his granddaughter Jessica and Inspector Murray, must stop Dracula and his followers before they can carry out their sinister plan. Satanic Rites of Dracula, just like Dracula AD 1972, is in modern times, but the grooviness, fun, and gothic London atmosphere is traded in for something that's a little more bland and aimless. The film feels more spy thriller than a cult, and it feels more Satanism than vampirism. It is the final film to feature Christopher Lee as Dracula for Hammer, even though Peter Cushing would return. Scars of Dracula gets a bit of a bad rep from Hammer fans as kind of a black sheep of the series, but if you polled a bunch of Hammer fans, I'd say Satanic Rites deserves that reputation more. Some of my favorite scenes: the opening ceremony,
and 7 times 7 damned again.
a dungeon staking scene, Dracula versus Van Helsing,
Me. A silver bullet. Dracula.
and Dracula entering a cheap-looking room to bite a girl. For me, Satanic Rites of Dracula is only a must-watch if you feel like you have to complete all of Hammer's Dracula films. It's incredibly low budget, and the story and dialogue do very little for me. There are a few highlights with some traditional vampire action, but for me, Dracula AD 1972 is the only modern Dracula interpretation that Hammer got right. Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter from 1974. Captain Kronos was a swashbuckling horror adventure film by Brian Clemens. This was the only film Brian Clemens actually directed. He's famous for inventing the Thriller series, which actually is a bit like Hammer House of Horror, albeit a little bit better in my opinion. Thriller also casts a lot of former Hammer actors, so if you watch a lot of Hammer films, you'll probably recognize a few actors in some of the episodes. Captain Kronos is the third and final entry in the stand-alone vampire films for Hammer. It was meant to be a series with Captain Kronos going around, maybe presumably fighting other vampires or other creatures, but at this point in 1974, Hammer's days were numbered. Captain Kronos stars German actor Horst Janssen in the lead role, with veterans John Carson and Hammer favorites Shane Bryant and Carolyn Monroe. The film follows Captain Kronos, a master swordsman and former soldier who, along with his hunchback assistant, Professor Grost, hunts vampires. They are called to a village plagued by death, marked by highly accelerated aging. Kronos and Grost discover that the victims are being drained of their youth by a vampire. Along the way, they are joined by Carla, a local girl. The trio must uncover a vampire's identity and put an end to the terror. The film stands out for its unique representation of horror and swashbuckling action, and not to mention there's some humor involved, although some of it lands and some of it doesn't. The film explores themes of youth, mortality, and the supernatural, and like a lot of Hammer's late entries in the 70s, it might have not been a huge commercial success at the time, but since then it's definitely garnered its fans. I remember seeing it late one night on AMC, probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. Some of my favorite scenes include Kronos fighting the guy in the bar,
Crookback will do for me.
But not me,
Why?
because I don't like it.
Kronos fighting in general, the mystical test conducted to detect the presence of a vampire, and the climactic battle between Kronos and the vampire. It took me a while to fully appreciate Captain Kronos as I had become accustomed to Hammer's earlier works, but as I became more accustomed to their 70s work, I began to appreciate this unique blend of action and horror, not to mention the characters are really easy to like. It provides an early look what could have been in the series, and I guess part of the fun is thinking about what the next entry or series of entries could have been. The Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, 1974. This is a British-Hong Kong joint effort where Hammer teamed up with Shaw Brothers. That way, it was directed by both Roydwar Baker and Chang Che. As you could probably guess, a lot of the martial arts scenes were filmed by Shaw Brothers while Hammer took care of some of the gothic atmosphere. Peter Cushing returns to the role of Van Helsing, but once again playing a descendant, along with David Chang, Julie Edge, and John Forbes Robertson as Dracula, although David Chang plays Dracula in a different form. The film opens in 1804 when a Taoist monk named Ka travels to Transylvania to seek the help of Count Dracula in restoring the power of the 7 golden vampires in rural China. Dracula agrees, but takes over Ka's body to escape his castle. A century later in 1904, Professor Van Helsing is lecturing at a Chinese university about the legend of the 7 golden vampires. He is approached by a student who confirms the legend and asks for Van Helsing's help in defeating the vampires. Van Helsing, his son, and a wealthy widow all join forces along with some kung fu trained siblings to battle the vampires and Dracula. Legend of the 7 golden vampire was famous for being not only the last Dracula film for Hammer, but also the last vampire film. Hammer was definitely trying to stay relevant in these times, to stay afloat, and they were trying new things. And partnering with Shaw Brothers, who were pretty big at the time, seemed like a pretty good move. I'm not sure how commercially successful this was upon its release, but it seems to have found a spot with Hammer fans who like it. Hammer fans generally seem to be favorable with this film, even without Lee. Some of my favorite scenes include the resurrection of the 7 golden vampires by Count Dracula, the intense battles between the Kung Fu siblings and the vampires, and the climactic showdown between Van Helsing and Dracula for the final time. If you were feeling jaded by the Dracula series with Christopher Lee, how it ended, you might want to give this one a try. It feels more invigorating than the bland, confusing nature of Satanic Rites of Dracula. And Peter Cushing, once again, gives a strong performance. He never phoned anything in. It's a fun film in a different setting, but you know what? They brought back the Dracula theme song. And in that way, it kind of makes the film feel like it came full circle and that it can bow out with dignity. Thank you so much for watching this video. I have a ton of fun going through all this stuff. I can talk about Hammer horror for days, and I'd love to read your comments. If you have other things to say about Hammer horror, let me know your memories, your thoughts. It's great having you with me, and I'll catch you next time.